there's always a lot of news stories. We live in this time of 24-hour, not even 24 hours news cycle. It's the 120 character tweet, Twitter post. Sorry. I'm showing my forgetfulness already this evening. X posts are how we get our news today. Short sound bites. So it's very common for news stories kind of take over the world. We're all focused on one big news story for a little while, and then we chase it down, find everything we can read about it, and then we move on. But still, once in a while, there are stories that are so striking, so shocking to the public, that they seem to last for a while. There's a news story right now that I first heard of back in 2023 that made a big splash back then when a great tragedy happened, and then kind of was forgotten for a couple of years, but now over the past 2 weeks has again dominated most Americans' social media feeds and a lot of podcast discussion, and maybe you know what I'm talking about. Anyone have an idea what this shocking news story might be? Yeah.
The mom who killed her kids.
Lindsay Clancy, yeah, this happened in 2023. This great tragedy, if you've not heard about it, Lindsay Clancy in 2023, she had 3 children, and they were strangled by her. Now, there's a lot of debate happening right now. In the court, in the hearing, based on whether she is actually responsible because she may not be culpable because of her psychosis she had following the birth of her 3rd child. There's a big debate happening there. There's even some really weird debates happening about whether the father was somehow involved, for which there's no evidence whatsoever. But there's one really interesting thing happening. So everyone reading this story, seeing this mom had 3 young children. She strangled them. They died. Dad came home, found them. She jumped out of a window trying to kill herself. Everyone looks at this, and they're having a lot of side discussion about, was it true psychosis? Is she really responsible? Is she not responsible because she is not able to make good decisions like normal people? Was a dad involved? Those are a lot of the conversations happening, some legitimate, some not. But there's one thing no one is debating right now. Not a single person, I have scoured the internet as possible as I can. I have not found a single person arguing that Lindsay Clancy, whether responsible or not, her action of strangling her 3 kids, no one is arguing whether or not that is moral. Why is that? Why is there no debate whatsoever on that question? Any ideas? Okay, yeah, that's what's so surprising about it, right? So we live in a culture that would tell you there's no standard of right and wrong, right? So you choose what is right for you, and that's really good for you to decide that thing, make your moral code, and live consistently with it. But for Bo to make his moral code and expect me to follow it would be bigotry, prejudice, absurd. This is what's super interesting. We say there's no single moral code, and yet there's unanimous agreement today that what Lindsay did, whether she's responsible or not, to what level, that's an interesting question, but no one says she was doing a moral act by killing her children. We have universal agreement that this is a wrong thing to do. And I find that very awkward because of what Bo just said. It makes sense to me. I mean, I believe in a moral code. I believe there's right and wrong. It makes sense to me that we'd all see this evil thing and say, yes, that's wrong, that's evil, that should not happen. But it strikes me as very, very odd in our culture. I was listening to a podcast this week of Sean McDowell, a Christian apologist, debating with this comic book creator about right and wrong. And this comic book creator makes these comic books of, he invented Venom, the Spider-Man villain, and he is talking about the comic books he makes. And in these comic books, always, superhero movies and comic books have evil and good, right? When you're watching a Spider-Man movie or reading a comic book, you don't root for the villain, usually anyway, right? You don't root for them. You root for the good guy, right? And this guy should know that, but when Sean McDowell asks him, is justice real for everyone? He said, nah, it's just my view. And that's what's so interesting here, that a lot of people today think, yeah, truth is relative. You decide what's right and wrong. And yet all of us looking at this news story, we all say that was clearly wrong. And that's what I want to look at this evening. We look at that as an example of evil, and rightly so. The world looks at it and says, yes, it's evil too. But my question is, whose worldview actually is justified in saying that what Lindsay Clancy did and every other evil act, take your pick throughout history, who is actually justified based on their worldview, conclusions, perspectives, who is justified in actually calling this true evil? And I don't think all worldviews are able to do that. And I often pick on one key worldview, and that is atheism. There's a reason for that. Tonight I want to look at atheism again versus Christianity, because atheism is a growing worldview. As you know, there's a growing population of people calling themselves nuns, not Catholic women. The N-O-N-E-S, right? They have no religion, they say, which is not true. Everyone has a religion. Religion being the way you look at the world, your belief, your answer to the big questions. Is there a God? What is man's purpose? Who are we? What are we here for? What is our major problem? How do we solve that problem? That is your religion, whether it be in the God of the Bible, in Buddha, in science itself, which fails to answer any of those questions, or it be in you, yourself. We all have something or someone we worship. And tonight I want to look at evil, seen like in Lindsay Clancy's case. When the whole world is saying, yes, that's evil, my question is, okay, we all agree, but who actually can make sense of that? Given atheism, how is it possible we all agree on this? That's really kind of odd and surprising to me. Given Christianity, it's no surprise whatsoever. That's where we're going tonight. I want to look at evil as evidence for God. And so I do have a handout for you that I printed, and I was rushing to get this done, so I'll just pass them out. You can take one, pass it on. Hopefully we have enough. If not, we can make some more copies perhaps. There's a second page I'll give to you in a moment, but there you go. So evil as evidence for God. That's what we're going to look at this evening. We all agree there is evil. The question is, can we make sense of it with our worldview? And it's a quick disclaimer. Tonight's going to be a brief discussion of evil. This could encompass or span many, many evenings. Also, so we're not going to go as deep as we maybe could go. That's why I'm summarizing with two general ideas here. We have the Christian worldview that we're convinced is true, revealed by God in his general creation. We look around, we can see a lot of things about God, look at the creation, learn about him. We also have a special revelation. Jesus came down and revealed God to us. We have the written word. That's where we get Christianity from. Atheism, it's a hodgepodge of worldviews here, but generally we're looking at the idea that there is no God. That's the idea, the core idea of atheism we'll consider this evening. But one other side note, when you think about this evening, our discussion together is exploring this with people, and I recommend you do this. When you have people in your life who are atheistic, agnostic, maybe nominal Christians, you can discuss. It's interesting to me that we all agree, universally, atheist, Christian alike, we agree that Lindsay Clancy did something wrong. Her level of responsibility, maybe that's up for debate, but the action itself, killing children, that was wrong. How do we make sense of that? It's a good thing to do, but I don't want you to misunderstand me here. I'm not suggesting that by doing this, you can manipulate someone into becoming a Christian, right? Obviously, that's not the idea here. But our job is to present the truth and also to deal with intellectual objections people have to the faith. Think of Paul on Mars Hill. When Paul was on Mars Hill, he said, you people, you believe in a God, and he quotes their poetry about Zeus and other gods where they say that we are his offspring, right? We have this common ground with the atheists, or not the atheists because they weren't atheists, they believed in gods, but the learned people of Athens. He said, you believe in this thing, and yet you have this misunderstanding of it. If you're God's offspring, you couldn't make that God in your image make him and have him stuck to a temple. That couldn't be. And Paul works them through their ideas to point them to the truth of who God is. And the same is true here. As we explore evil and how worldviews make sense of that, the goal is not to trap someone into suddenly, by accident, becoming a Christian. The goal is to remove obstacles between them and the cross. You can't make them bow to the cross, make them accept Christ's lordship, make them want to follow after him. But as you remove these obstacles that make them think that Christianity is not true, you bring them closer to the cross where they may bow the knee, they may become a follower of Jesus. We are not, the Spirit can't do his hidden work, but we can certainly do the work of sharing the truth with people and handling reasons they have for why they believe that our faith is not true. All right, so with that in mind, we're going to ask three general questions this evening. The big question is, which worldview makes sense of the evil we see in the world? There are various options. Which worldview makes sense of the evil we see in the world? And to explore that, I want to look at three major questions. We're going to pose to both large worldviews here. We have the general worldview of atheism, and then specifically our worldview of Christianity. We're going to ask, how should things be? If we see evil, it seems to imply that something is wrong, so how should things be? Which worldview, in each worldview, how do we cast a vision for how the world ought to be, how things ought to be? And secondly, we'll look at what is evil. We all say that when a mom kills her children, when a man beats his wife, evil is happening. How do we understand what that evil is? And thirdly, what happens in the end? If, we all know what happens in the end as far as our earthly life, it's over, we get buried. Is the end, or is there something beyond the end? Is the end not yet the end? These are three general questions that Christianity and atheism answer very, very differently. How should things be? What is evil? And what happens after all this? What happens after the end of our earthly lives? Those are three questions we're going to ask, starting with how should things be? Now, when you read the news story of Lindsay Clancy, and if you hadn't heard it before tonight, sorry if you had to share this really awful story with you. It's pretty hard to avoid in the news right now. But when you read stories like this, a mom strangling her children, men beating their wives, all kinds of crimes, when people talk about this, what kind of words do they use to describe those awful events? What do they say? That is fill in the blank. Tragedy. That's a tragic. That is horrific. Terrible. Depraved. There's a loaded word. Very good. Yeah. That is unjust. That's not right. That's not how things should be, right? They use phrases like that a lot, right? Because we perceive something as wrong, and if things are not the way they should be, when we look at Lindsay's story and say, that's not how a mom ought to act, we're implying something else. If there is a way things should be. If we can all say this is not right, that means there is a right way to be, right? So if we say moms should not do that, we're saying there is a way that moms ought to live and is not doing what Lindsay did. So if things are not the way they should be, it simply follows logically there's a way things ought to be, a way things should be. Now, this is a problem for atheism. If there's a way things should be, how might that be problematic for the atheist? Any ideas? Right, well said, Bo. Yeah, it says who, right? So we would say there's a way things should be because there's someone beyond humankind, above us, beyond us, an objective standard beyond us, dictating how we ought to live. On atheism, there's no God beyond us. So Evan is a human, I'm a human. We might both say we have a good moral code, but why should Jim have to follow our moral code, right? Who am I to force my moral view on him? It's just he said, going back and forth. There's no objective standard beyond us. This is very awkward for atheists, because on atheism, there's just no way things should be. There's no moral imperative to live a certain way. I'm not saying atheists can't recognize things are wrong. They do all the time, right? Again, many atheists are saying, this mom who did this thing, she shouldn't have done it. But they can't tell you why there is a way she ought to have lived. They might say, I recognize that's wrong, but ask them, well, why is it wrong? They'll say, we all know it's wrong. I get that, but why do we know it's wrong? On your worldview, how can you appeal to any objective standard of morality that all people ought to follow? And I don't want to just, suggest that I'm just straw-manning atheists. So let me give it to you from one of the leading atheists of maybe more like 15 years ago, Richard Dawkins, in his book, Out of Eden. I'm sorry, I skipped that part. I think you already got it in your notes, though. He quoted in his book, River Out of Eden, he said this pretty plainly. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. What he's saying here is this. No creator, right? Atheism is the idea that we just emerged by accident from an uncaring cosmos, no God, no one designed us. We just emerged by chance, right? So there's no purpose to us. If you make a chair, you design it with purpose. You have purpose for it, right? If God made you you have purpose that he put into you, baked in the cake of what it means to be human. But there's no God in atheism. So there's no purpose. And Richard Dawkins says, so there's no purpose to the world at all. There's no design, nothing, no way things ought to be. Without a creator, you can't have a purpose. When you have a created thing, a car, a table, whatever, again, there's purpose given by the creator of that thing. But if all this happened by chance, there's no actual design. We all choose to live how we want to live, and it's very unfair for Jackie to assume that Steve ought to live the way she wants to live, right? No one designed Jackie or Steve. They can both live however they want to live. That's consistent with atheism, which is why it's really awkward when they say, that's not how moms ought to act. Well, says who, right? How do you know there's a way moms ought to act? There's no purpose to being a mom, given atheism. That's a great soundbite, right? Says there's no purpose to being a mom. Given atheism, there would be no purpose to being a mom. That's awkward, though, when they say there is a purpose, and she did what she ought not to have done. And this is, again, though atheists will frequently use language like that. They'll say, well, this is unjust. This is not how things ought to be. Something went wrong. They see problems when they see things going off of the standard of how things should be, but they can't justify that standard. They can't give you reason for why there is a way things ought to be. A couple years ago, I was at a campus in northern Ohio talking to students. You know what I do. We stand there on campus with signs showing babies growing in the womb, also babies killed by abortion, and ask people, what do you think about this? And I know we're often known for, and rightly so, our conversations on abortion, moving people to see abortion as an evil that ought not be pursued. It's not the way things should be. But so frequently when you talk about evil, right and wrong, morals, you quickly go beyond abortion to bigger questions. And so very often we're discussing with students, is there a God? Who is the real God? Who is Jesus? Is there a good reason to believe Jesus actually rose from the dead? All those important questions. And one day, a couple years ago, I was talking about that with a girl named Catherine, just a few hours north of here in Ohio. And she was appealing to evil as a reason to not believe in God. She thought it actually proved he is not real. And as we discussed that, and I was talking to her about it, I found that even in our conversation, though atheism has no basis for saying that this is the way things should be, she kept appealing to that kind of standard, saying that there is a way things ought to be. And I was just so confused by that. Well, I know what's going on, right? She perceives reality and then fights against it with her objection to the true God. But when you talk to atheists about this, it's interesting hearing the conversation and listening to them being unable to stop using those words like unjust, terrible, all the things you said a moment ago. So I'm going to play for you a short clip of our conversation. And as you listen, just listen for the language she used, her language where she assumes there is a way things should be, and that sometimes things don't go that way. Listen for the phrases, words she uses in our brief conversation here. But see, atheism can't say that's wrong, because there is no right and wrong on atheism.
I probably still have some.
Leftover morals hanging out there, yeah.
My parents are still very
Yeah. So part of your life. But isn't that a good thing that you would look at someone abusing a girl and using her as a sex slave and say it's wrong? Isn't that good that you would say that?
Yeah, it's good that I can see the flaws in the world. You know, I've gone down the wrong path. I've done some things, like I said, I'm not proud of. But,
sure, so have I. Yeah, so have I.
So, you know.
But I just don't understand how atheism could say anything is wrong, because there is no moral. There's just what is.
I think there's a moral of what your parents give you.
All right, at the end she gave her kind of her standard there, which we'll come back to in a minute. But what language does she use that shows that she believes there's a way things should be and that sometimes things don't go right? Did you catch any phrases in what she said? I would have the wrong path. Yeah, right. Well, that implies there's a right path, right? How do you know what is the right path? I mean, if you make your own moral code, by definition, any path you go down is the right path for you, right? When you say there's a wrong path, that implies there is a right path you ought to be on. She's done things she's not proud of. She even says, good that I can see the flaws in the world. Well, how do you know there are flaws in the world, right? Atheism does not tell you that there is a designer who created purpose, and when you go off that purpose, you're doing something wrong. Atheism says, what is. There is no ought. There's no should. There is just what is. So what you do just is. It's not right or wrong. In any objective way, it might feel personally wrong to you. It might not be someone else's preferences, but you can't say there's a designer who gave us purpose and you went off course. Right? If you often when I'm driving and the GPS is helping me out and I get chatting with Aubrey or someone else in the car, I miss my turn, right? What happens? It reroutes me again because we went the wrong way. It's keeping you on the path, right? There's a plan, a place you're going toward. That makes sense. But on atheism, again, there's no end goal we're working toward. There just is what is. This is all by chance. And so you can't say anything really is the wrong path. And so they keep using those words even though they can't justify it. Now, Catherine here, what was her standard at the end for where morals come from? Parents. Any problems with that being the objective standard for morals? What's the problem with it? Parents are wrong. Parents can be wrong. They're flawed, right? Certainly. And my parents might not agree with your parents, right? So what do we do then? Who's actually right? It's a way you can explain how you get your morals that way. You can't explain why they're actually binding on anyone. I could explain to you that it's likely you'll become a Muslim if you grow up in a Muslim family, but that doesn't mean that Islam is actually true. right? So we're not asking, how did you get your morals? Maybe they came from your parents. Our question is, how do you know any code of morals actually are true, objective? And given atheism, there is no such thing at all as objective morals. There just is what is. Now, a famous atheist long ago saw this problem and converted to Christianity because of it. And you all know him, C.S. Lewis. He wrote about this and spoke about this years ago, about this inherent problem with atheism. He said, my argument against God, reflecting upon his atheism, was the universe seemed so cruel and unjust, seeing all the evil, right? But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. You could never look at a branch as that branch is really crooked unless you knew what a straight line is. And all these people who say, well, Lindsay Clancy did something immoral, or this other person did something evil, when they say there's something wrong, they're implying a standard of goodness. Just the same way Lewis would say you can't call a line crooked unless there is such a thing as a straight line. And this is one of the biggest problems in atheism. All the time they say, evil, evil, evil. How can a good God exist? Important question to unpack, right? But the question turns back on them. You keep saying evil, evil, evil. How do you know what evil is if there isn't a designer, God, who is good, who gave us the moral code we ought to follow? So that's atheism. Well, what about our worldview? Pretty easy, right? Much, much different. So if atheism begins with a world that just by chance burps out people and beauty by accident, what does our worldview begin with? What was before the world, before the world, fill in the blank, what? There was who? God, right? In the beginning. So we know Jesus was with God in the beginning, John 1:1. But if you Genesis 1, we see the very beginning of all things, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens, the earth. Yeah, we know in John 1:1, this is not, this is the Trinity was there. Jesus was creating, active in creation. So this is what our worldview begins with, Genesis 1:1. We don't begin with stuff, with just chance. We begin with a person, with the Trinity, with three persons who are God. That is the beginning of our worldview. From that, we get everything. And this is very important, right? One little Bible verse that unpacks so very much. This is the designer. So there was not only a beginning to the world, before the beginning, there was someone, God, and God created. He created. Again, when you create something, you put purpose into it, design into it, and God created our world with purpose. What is the purpose of the world? If you think through what our purpose is and what the world's purpose is. What is the purpose of the world that God created? That's exactly it, right? Yep. I skipped ahead. I maybe put this verse in there, but we see this in Psalm 19:1. Psalm 19:1, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. There is not only beauty, that beauty is a purpose, right? You walk as the beautiful stars. They are not there only to look at. Yes, they are there for that, but they also declare something. They declare the glory of God. They proclaim who he is. And humankind, we have a purpose too, right? We read in Micah 6:8, he has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. This is our purpose, right? In a nutshell, that we are to be in a relationship with him, to follow after him. We're not merely dropped here for the purpose of enjoying our life. Everything has a purpose. Creation itself declares God's glory, points to him, and we are to follow him, to do justice, to walk humbly with him, to love kindness. This is our purpose. So we can look at Lindsay Clancy or anyone else, fill in the blank, with someone who's done something wrong and say, something is wrong there, because God created that person with a purpose, and that person went off course, right? And that is, so we can clearly say that's wrong. Not only just, I don't like it, it truly is objectively immoral what that person did that should not have done. So quick worldview check here so far. When you hear someone say, this is not how things should be, what do the two worldviews actually say? What do they actually mean by that? The atheist really means, when you say things are not as they ought to be, that's really just an illusion. The consistent atheist would say there really is no right or wrong path. When you say it's not how it ought to be, you're really just saying that you don't think it's how things ought to be, but it's not really wrong in any real sense. Your moral code is just an illusion. It's not really binding for everyone. It's not objective. When Christians see something gone very wrong, we could say that is evil, because that is an aberration, perversion of how God designed the world to be and humans to act. So on the first question, it's pretty clear where the two worldviews fall. Our second question, what is evil? Well, we start at the beginning, Genesis 1:1. God created the heavens and the earth, right? That was pretty simple. Are you at the end of your notes already? No, you're not there yet. Okay, I don't think so. Okay. God created the heavens and the earth, but then what happened after creation pretty quickly? What did our first Adam do? He sinned, right? Yeah, exactly. So our first federal head, Adam, representing us before God, sinned, cursed all of mankind. We are, he didn't curse us. He did the action which led to the curse, the fall. And so we are now living with what he did. And every time we sin, we are affirming his action to do that, right? To rebel against God. So we have the beginning. God created humankind. God gave us purpose. And we know that in the beginning, what happened, something went wrong, and that's what evil is. God made man in his own image. We see this in Genesis 1 again. God made man in his image to reflect him. We are to follow him, to be in a relationship with him. He made us, because we're made in his image, we're able to make choices. God is a being who makes choices. He made us his image. We can make choices as well. And the first Adam, he made a wrong choice. He chose to sin. So we're able to make choices, and we made the wrong one. And that choice of evil affects everyone. In Genesis 3, you can unpack actually let's look briefly at that. Genesis 3, 16 through 19, looking at the curse. We see how this original sin affected all of creation. In 16 through 19, we read this to the woman and then to the man. To the woman, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. And to Adam he said, because you've listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten of the tree of which I've commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat of the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So this you get many, the whole world changed because of sin, right? Adam didn't only affect the human race, he affected everything. It's like taking a glass globe and hitting it with a hammer, you get all the spidery cracks going everywhere. It's not just a local little problem, it touches everything, and sin touched everything. So we are cursed. The ground has changed, all of creation has changed because of that original sin. And that's what we see we are living with. So we can make sense of this. When we ask the second question, what is evil? We point back to the beginning, not to God, not to creation. He's where we get design and purpose. We point to Adam and say, well, God made humans able to make choices, and that's good, but we chose to abuse our choice. We made the wrong choice, and that is what evil is. We still have a standard of goodness, that is God, right? So we know we read this, you are good and do good. That's not humankind, that's God. God is our standard of goodness. That's how we know what is good, looking to him. His nature is a standard of goodness. Evil then is not this alternate fighting force. This is not like Star Wars, the good and dark side of the force. Rather, what we have here is God is good, and when you have an absence of good, that is where evil is. When someone chooses to do something that is off the path of what is good, that is evil. Evil is not this force, this alternate God fight. It's not yin and yang fighting together, duking it out to the end, and you don't know who's going to win. Rather, you have the good God who is good, and the humankind who makes choices that rebel against him. That is what evil is. Evil is an absence of good. It's not a thing you can touch or smell, and we can recognize it, but evil is where there's an absence of good. There's an old song by Switchfoot, the shadow proves the sunshine. So I'm showing my age here, I suppose. But it's a good old song from maybe the early 2000s. I don't know. Late 90s. Yeah, great album. It's a great album, right? It's true, right? When you have a shadow is not a substance. It's the lack of sunshine. Peter Pan, I'm sorry, he was wrong, right? You can't go to a dark room and find your shadow there. I mean, I guess a candle can put a shadow on the wall. I suppose that could happen, right? But you can't have a shadow without some source of light. And that's what shadow is. That's what evil is. We don't say, when people say, oh, what that mom did is evil, we don't say, yeah, there's this evil force out there. We say, yes, she chose to rebel. Or anyone who does wrong chooses to rebel. I know there's a big debate about her culpability, so I don't want to speak to that, I suppose. It's a good question to unpack, but when someone chooses wrong, they're rebelling against God, and that is what evil is. An absence of good. It's not a thing. It's not created by God as this ultimate force fighting against him. It is creatures he made that he gave free will to, able to make choices, choosing to abuse that. And when we see evil because of this, when we see evil, we are rightly offended by it because God is offended. This is what's so interesting. When you break, when you go against the law of gravity in an airplane, you don't feel any guilt behind it. There's no offense there. When you break God's moral law, you feel guilt because you innately recognize I've offended the moral lawgiver behind this moral code that I'm supposed to be, that was made for me to follow. So you recognize you offended him, and that's why we feel guilt. That and also we also offend other people too. We feel guilt when we offend people. God is the moral lawgiver behind the moral law, is the one offended when his law is broken. But we can share that, right? We look at people doing evil things and say, that's offensive. We recognize that is wrong. We feel offended when we see babies who are aborted, when we see single moms struggling after abandonment, and we hear about tragedies like the Clancy children. In all those things, we feel offended, and rightly so, because, again, there's a designer who gave purpose to the world, who is himself good. He's the moral standard of what we should follow, and we recognize he's offended, and we're offended because he placed that moral law on us, being made in his image, and we're offended when we see it broken as well. That's, again, the Christian worldview. So the answers truly are in Genesis here, right? So in the beginning, God created the heavens, the earth. We then see what happened later, that man broke that. He offended God, rebelled against him. That's how we understand evil. But back to atheism. How does atheism understand evil? Well, I already gave you the quote before. Richard Dawkins said this. To quote another line, he said, there's no evil, no good. Atheists would tell you evil is just an illusion. Because again, there's no moral lawgiver who is good. There's no design or purpose. So when you see things you think are evil, that's just an illusion. Now, tell that to Patrick Clancy, whose 3 children were killed. Tell him the deep heartache he has knowing his children were killed. Tell him that was an illusion. That's not going to land. When someone sees their family member hurt in whatever tragedy, if you tell them that's an illusion, that's just not going to land. And it really shouldn't. When we see those things, we know that something really evil has happened. Again, someone has gone against, broken God's moral law. He is good. The heavens declare his glory. We're to follow his moral law that was broken. That's how we can say that is evil. It's off the path. It's breaking, rebelling against the moral law and how he made us to live. There is a way he made humans to be, and we are breaking that, rebelling against it. It just does not work. But Dawkins is not alone in saying this. Other atheists say similar things. Because I mentioned before, God made man in his image. We read that in Genesis 1. That means that we're able to make choices because we don't share all of God's attributes. Some of them are communicable to us, shared with him to some extent, not fully as they are in him. We are able to make choices, and we make often wrong choices. That's when we sin, rebel against him. That's what free will here is, that he gave you the ability to make choices. Sam Harris, another atheist, would tell you that's all just kind of, again, silly, right? That's a myth. He says this. He says that free will is an illusion. Either our wills are determined by prior causes, and we are not responsible for them, or they're the product of chance, and we are not responsible for them. So again, you see someone shoot someone, cold blood. Why would you prosecute him? If he didn't act, if he's not responsible for that, if he's merely, as Dawkins said, dancing to his DNA, you can't say he did anything evil that we should hold him responsible for. It would be unthinkable to say that's actually wrong, that's actually evil. He was merely determined to do that. It's not his fault. And Harris concludes, this understanding, he says, reveals you to be a biochemical puppet. That's all you are. But if you're a biochemical puppet, why would we ever hold you responsible for anything that you do? It really is very awkward. So these are very different ways of looking at evil. Christianity says, yes, evil is not an illusion because God is real. He's a standard of goodness. Evil is rebelling against him and his good standard. Atheism would say, no, it's just an illusion. Jim?
I was going to say, it's interesting he uses the word puppet because a puppet needs a puppy. It's
That's a really good point. Who's behind there, right? That's a great question. It does. I like that. That's a really good point. That's really, really good. So when you read tragedies, though, which happens all the time, again, this is the latest example. I think, again, the Clancy one is so interesting because it's the unanimous agreement. When children are killed like that, we all agree this is wrong. But it's not unusual that we see other stories similarly that just capture our attention. Just this year, a tragedy happened with a National Guard member. You might have heard down, former National Guard member, I think in Louisiana. He killed 8 children. Awful, horrible thing happened, right? Which worldview rings true? When you see that, when you say, that's just an illusion. That's not really wrong. Does that really sit right with you? No. When someone says that's evil, because that's rebelling against the way we ought to live, which is revealed by God, that makes sense of it, right? You can see the really awkwardness here, and that's why I find it so fascinating. And if you encounter anyone in your life who's an atheist, you could just ask them, what do you think is going on in this story, the Lindsay Clancy story, regardless of her culpability, which I think is a great discussion to have, regardless of that, is it right or wrong to kill children? What do you think? And if it's really wrong, how do you know? Says who? All right, that leads to our final question for tonight, and that is, what happens in the end? So far we've looked at what is evil, and also, sorry, there you go, Roy. How should things be? What is the pattern for things ought to be, and what is evil? Last question, what happens in the end? What happens in the end of the story for the atheist? What do they believe happens in the end? To stop existing, right? Nothing. The end is truly the end. This is what Bertrand Russell said long ago. He said it very, I don't know if he meant to say this in a way that was inspiring. To me, it is very depressing if you're an atheist reading this, but this is how he conceives of the end. No heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave. All the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system. Put that on a Hallmark card, right? It really be encouraging, right? So it's just all going to end, right? On atheism, there's no ultimate justice. This is what gets really interesting, right? So you've probably all known stories, whether newsworthy or not, where someone does something really awful and gets away with it. They are not held accountable by a man's court. When this happens, justice is truly thwarted because given atheism, there's no justice beyond the grave. It all ends. There is no ultimate justice on atheism. We're all going to end up in the same grave, right? Whether you were a Corrie ten Boom who fought to save Jews and had to go to the concentration camp and saw her family killed, whether you were Corrie, whether you were Hitler, it doesn't really matter in the end. They both rotted in similar cold graves. That's the end of atheism. There's no ultimate justice because we all go to the same end, the same grave. And interestingly, if you ask someone, an atheist, does that bother you? It'd be interesting to hear their answer. I've never asked them that, but would it bother you that Corrie ten Boom and Hitler both face the same end? They might just shrug and say, it just is the way things are, right? It does bother me that would be where things end. Not because Corey's so great, you know why, because Corey had faith in someone who is so great. But, so atheism is pretty simple, right? The end, just disappear, go out of existence. There's nothing beyond this. It's all over. In Christianity, there is ultimate justice. And this is where when you're tracking with the discussion, looking right now at evil things happen in the world, not just Lindsay Clancy, think beyond that to other stories of evil. When you see evil things happening, we can say, yes, this is the way things ought to be. This is a perversion of that way things ought to be. This is a rebellion against God, who's the standard of goodness. That's how we understand this. And we also can say, even if no one ever holds that person accountable, they don't get to thwart justice. There's no act of evil that can ever thwart God's justice. That'd be really bad news for us if Christ didn't take our place as our representative, right? Because our evil is not thwarted either. It's just was punished in someone else, not in us. But in Christianity, there is ultimate justice. You cannot thwart it. You cannot somehow escape God's eye as if he did not see this. And this is what's, I think, ultimately so encouraging. In 1 Thessalonians, to just jump around a little bit, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, we read, like I read here from my notes, this passage I find very comforting. If you ever do think of a time where someone does something evil and the courts do not hold him or her responsible, we read this in 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 3 through 6. For this is the will of God. It's a very popular passage. For this is the will of God, your sanctification, that you abstain from sexual immorality, that each one of you know how to control his own body in holiness and honor, not in the passion of lust like the Gentiles who do not know God, that no one transgress and wrong his brother in this matter, because the Lord is an avenger in all these things, as we told you beforehand and solemnly warned you. What's an avenger? You see Thor in your mind, or Captain America? I think they confuse understanding the word avenge to avenge something, because the Avengers are supposed to come in like prevent evil from happening, right? That's their goal, to stop the bad guy. That's not what it means to avenge something. To avenge is to punish the wrongdoing, hold them accountable. And God is an avenger. That means in the end, all these evil acts will be held accountable. Either Christ already dealt with it, that's true for all who believe in him and trust in him, or you will face punishment, the wrath of God. But it's not going to escape his eye. I find this very comforting. So often we see the judgment of God as this awkward, embarrassing doctrine. It's a very comforting one. That our God will not allow any small act, even if no one ever knows what someone did to you, he saw it. He will hold that person accountable. Again, either they're forgiven and Christ took that person's place, or they will bear his wrath. But that evil action on you will not escape his eye. I find that exceptionally comforting. So after this, judgment. John 5, verses 28 to 29, we read this. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and come out, those who've done good to the resurrection of life, and those who've done evil to the resurrection of judgment. We all will be resurrected, all of us, but not all of us to the same end. Resurrection to life or resurrection to death. Not based upon, I was talking to a Muslim recently, one of our outreaches, and he was explaining to me why he believes Islam is true, and I explained to him why I'm convinced Christianity is true, that our God is a true God. And I just said, well, tell me this, at the end, what's going to happen? So I'm just going to, it's a great scale, right? I'm hoping my good outweighs the bad. And I thought, whew, man, you really think that's going to happen? And he said, to be honest, I'm really nervous about it. I would be too, right? Not just for him, for me. Thank God we don't have a scale we're waiting on, right? If we don't have a scale we're just going to hope is going to weigh out, because we have confidence in what Christ and who he is, not who we are. So this is why, you might say all the evil in the world points to a God. I think that's true, because you need a God who is the standard of goodness to help us make sense of evil. The good news is it's not just some God out there who's real. It is the Christian God. Jesus is God. And that means not only do we know what evil is, and not only is there ultimate justice, but that means the great shocking truth of the gospel is that we will not have to bear God's wrath because of what Christ already did. And that's what's coming next. We know the end is not the end. The next better age is coming. We read this in Revelation, one of my favorite passages. John writes this, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. So we could say to the atheist who is seeing evil and getting uncomfortable, we could say, not only can we make sense of this for you, we can point you to something very, very good. And that is, yes, if you don't have faith in Christ, it is a terrifying thing. We read it's a terrifying thing to fall in the hands of the living God. None of us can fathom what that would be like. But if we have faith in Christ, we will not have to. So, summarizing all this in a worldview check, imagine someone comes to you for counsel. They've been abused, they've been violated by someone, and the abuser has somehow skipped man's justice. The courts have not held them responsible for what they have done, but this person still bears the scars, the wounds of what someone did to them. Who's going to be the better counselor to them? The consistent atheist or the biblical Christian? Absolutely, and why is that?
Because the biblical Christian is going to be able to point them to God, who's going to carry out justice.
Yeah.
And will not only carry out the justice that that person seemed to evade, but he can also give them healing
Yeah.
and point them toward a restored life.
Absolutely, that's exactly right. We can make sense of it, make sense of what they feel, what happened to them, this is really wrong, and point them to the good news. And imagine what would the atheists tell them. I mean, here's the problem. We're not consistent with our worldview. Even right, you read the Bible and realize, oh, I had this misunderstanding. I've got to correct my understanding of God to match what the Bible says, right? That's our project, our job. And so often, even we hold inconsistent ideas, and we want to be careful to follow what is actually true. That's why you should be a student of the Bible. Same is true for atheists. They'll borrow from Christianity here and borrow from Hinduism here and all this stuff, right? So they might counsel as a Christian. I think even Dawkins himself recently called himself a cultural Christian, which is kind of hilarious, right? That he would use that moniker after so long saying that we're evil people. But so they might not really counsel consistently with their faith in atheism. But if they would, imagine what they would say. This person comes and says, I was abused. I know this, but this person skipped justice and I don't know what to do. They would say, you know what? You didn't like what happened to you. And I get that, but it wasn't really wrong. The evil thing you think happened to you, that's an illusion. There's no such thing as evil. There's no such thing as justice, injustice. The way things are just are the way things are. That person who did that thing to you, they were just dancing to their DNA. They're not responsible for it. So you might say you don't like what they did, but they're not really responsible for any wrong thing against you. Is that going to be comforting? Thank God it's not truthful. That would be really damaging if that were the truth when horrible things happen. And the Christian will say, no, what happened was evil. It's the opposite of how God made it to be. This is wrong. And what you feel that was wrong for a reason, because your feelings are in alignment with reality. In reality, something horrible happened. God created the world in the beginning. He made the world. He made the world to declare who he is. The world points to who he is, beautiful, orderly. Those things are true about God. He then also revealed how we ought to live. We see this fully in the person of Christ, who is truly God, truly man. And this person who did this to you was rebelling against that God. This is truly evil. And maybe the course did not hold him responsible, but God will. Now, yes, if that person has faith in Christ, yes, he will not bear God's wrath, but that does not mean God's wrath is thwarted. It was, again, borne by someone else. But God is not indifferent. He cares so much for what someone did to you that he sent his son to take your place, that we could all be set free, all who believe in him. Now, again, which one is more comforting does not mean which one is true. But it's pretty obvious which worldview has greater comfort for those who experience evil. And everyone sees evil or experiences evil on some level through their lives, which is why I'm always astounded when people have such great faith in atheism, which offers no answer to these big questions. And Christianity is revealed to us by God in the word that you have in your hands, has all the answers. So, to summarize, in conclusion, evil is a massive stumbling block. It is a stumbling block to faith, but not faith in God, not faith in Christ. Evil is a massive stumbling block to faith in atheism. I am convinced, because if you truly perceive evil and you truly understand what atheism teaches, that it is an illusion, not real, when you see horrible things happen, how can you have faith in that system, which makes no sense of evil? It ought to make you run from atheism. I know, again, here, hopefully you already have run from atheism, right? Though we'd always welcome atheists to come here to be part of our discussion this evening, to hear what is true. But it ought to make all of us, remind us why it's so obvious that atheism is wrong. It cannot answer these critical questions. I'm not trying to mock atheists. What I'm trying to do is look fairly at their worldview and ask, can it make sense of this? And no, it cannot. Because again, if atheism is true, there's no way that things should be. Nothing has gone wrong because there's no purpose. So what is just what is. Nothing has gone wrong with the world. We all end up in the same grave someday. There's no good, no justice. Evil itself is an illusion. We shouldn't say it shouldn't be that way. That does not work in atheism. Instead, we should say, I don't like that. We can't say it should not be that way. Because when you say it should not be that way, you're implying a standard outside yourself. When you say, I don't like that, that's fair. You shouldn't say it shouldn't be that way. Evil also points to the truthfulness of Christianity, of our faith, because God is the personal standard of goodness. Again, in Psalms, we see that God is good. What he does is good. It's not only God's actions that are good. He's not like Allah, who can do right or wrong and might just choose to do good. God is by definition good. He cannot sin, cannot do evil. He is goodness. That's what we read in the Psalm. Not just he does goodness, he is good, we read. You are good. That's how we know that God is a standard of goodness. He made the world good too. He made us in his image, but then we rebelled against that. And that is where we get evil. So evil is helpful for recognizing atheism fails. That Christianity has a better answer to all these big challenges we face about evil, suffering. But again, as I mentioned a moment ago, thank God that's not where Christianity leaves us, just with understanding. It'd be really sad if all God had done was to reveal this to us, reveal to us who he is, that he is good and who we are, and that we are evil. And that was it. That'd be really tragic. But as you know, it's our privilege when we meet people who are wrestling with evil, suffering, those things. It's our great honor not to merely make sense of it for them, but to also to point them to how they can deal with their own evil, right? Because so often we talk about that person's evil and fail to reckon with the evil that we have in our own hearts. And I know you already know, you all could share many stories of doing this, but as we conclude here, one of the many times I've had the privilege of doing this was, again, on campus years ago. This is a long ago story from Western Kentucky University, a campus that was kind of designed like had a hill in the middle where I was with our team that day. And so that meant fun for us that everyone walking by could see us like kind of up on this great hill and had plenty of time to walk up and come share their thoughts of us, how much they loved us or didn't love us, as some of them did. And one lady I saw doing that, you could tell by their body language what they think pretty quickly when they approach us. And this lady came walking me, making a beeline for me. I thought, this is going to be a tough one. And it was, but not tough in that she was yelling at me, just tough because of what she was wrestling with. Her name is Betty, and Betty came walking to me that day and just said, this is disrespectful. And of course I said, well, I'm not trying to disrespect anyone today. She was, of course, referring to my signs showing babies growing and also babies killed by abortion, which points to evil, which is very powerful, I think, apologetic for pointing to God as you unpack what is evil. And so I said my goal is not to be disrespectful, but I don't want to love moms so much that I allow the evil actions against babies to go hidden. That's why I'm showing it today, but I'm not saying that I hate any woman or men who may choose to advocate for abortion, but I'm also showing what is happening to children. And she just kind of paused and said, so you don't hold this against anyone who's done this? I said, well, how could I? Because I know what you guys know, right? And I said, and as I said that, she started to pull her coat up to her eyes, and all I could see was a tiny bit of her eyes above her coat line. And I knew what that meant. I've done this enough that I know what that's code for. And I started explaining, I was unpacking, how could I hold this against anyone? Abortion is evil. I've never had an abortion. But I have certainly committed evil. I've rebelled against the same God as anyone who's had multiple abortions or one abortion. And so how can I hold it against them? Because I am not in any better place by default. I'm separated from God by my own evil, by my own choices to rebel against him. And so Betty then said, follow me, which is interesting to hear sometimes from people. So I thought she was going to walk away and go into some alley, just kind of ream me out for what I thought was probably her story. She walked me over to a sign showing a 12-week baby who had been killed and pointed and said, 20 years ago this week, I did that. And I've never told anyone for 20 years, not even her daughter, who at the time was 22, who was 2 years old when she aborted her daughter's sibling. And that's not all that uncommon for people to not tell anyone until they meet someone like me, because there's nothing online with telling me. I'm not a friend of theirs. They can confess to me, and there's no relational strain that would happen from that. And so she pointed and explained it to me, and she told me about how in the process afterward, the abortionist wouldn't let her see the baby afterwards. She couldn't see it, and she had never gotten up the nerve to Google it. She didn't really want to see, but also kind of did want to see, but clearly was carrying this heavy burden inside of her. And so I reiterated to her, I said, Betty, the reason you feel the way you feel as you look at this picture, you're touching reality here, right? Other people, I met a girl at Columbus State who also told me when she said she had an abortion, I said, how are you today? She told me, every day feels like hell. I told Betty and Julie the same thing. The reason you feel awful is because you didn't just do something that you don't like, right? You rebelled against God. Your action was wrong. It offended him, and you feel guilt because of that. That's the bad news. But what's the good news? You guys know it. Jesus Christ. Truly God, truly man. As being truly man, he can represent humankind before the Father. Being truly God, he's an infinite and he can atone for infinite sins. And so he did. And so I told Betty that the good news is, if you have faith in Jesus, your guilt is dealt with. Also, side note, also this is not why you should believe in him, but your child is with the Lord, I'm convinced. Bigger discussion for another night, right? What happens to babies who are aborted, but that's my understanding biblically of where they go. And so if you believe in Jesus, you're forgiven, and you would one day be with your child. Now, Betty did not pray the prayer that day, and I've never seen her since. I have no clue. And this is what the sad part of what I do, so the frustrating part of what I do is so often I have an interaction like that and they're gone. I don't know what happens later on. But I do know she left me saying she felt better because she could finally confront what she had done. I think what she meant by that was, I finally understand what I did. She understood finally for the first time what evil really is, and at least had heard the good news of how to deal with her evil. And so often we try to do penance and things like that, and that never is going to atone for our sin, right? And that's the great, great news we have. So when we hear these news stories of Lindsay, Clancy, things happening, we should capitalize on the moment to talk about the gospel with people. Because if everyone's agreeing that is evil, it raises the question, what is evil? How do we know what evil is? Where does that come from? How do you make sense of it? And also, how do we deal with our evil? So hopefully you have chances to do that with people in your life now, with other news stories as they arise, because evil will keep happening again and again. We'll keep seeing it. And we should take advantage of every opportunity to point people to the Lord. That does not mean we glory in what happens. We don't want no evil to happen, of course. But when it does happen, we can use it to point people to what God has done.